Everyone, and welcome back. So we are continuing our lecture series on Hope Leslie. Again, this is like an illustration that was with the book at the time. And we're going to talk about some historical background, some of the themes, and a few excerpts for you just to kind of show a little bit better what I'm talking about. If you haven't already seen the summary video, please make sure you go and watch that as well. So otherwise, let's get started. So first things first, the author. Catharine Maria Sedgwick was born in 1789, and she was one of the 19th century's America most prolific women writers. As a child, she was cared for by Elizabeth Freeman, a former slave, who was also known as Mum Bet. Sedgwick's father helped Freeman gain her freedom by arguing the case in county court in 1781. Now, I think I mentioned this in my Frederick Douglass lecture as well, but this last name Freeman was not uncommon for people who had been freed to take on that as their last name to show that they were free and no longer enslaved. After winning her freedom, Freeman accepted the offer to work at the Sedgwicks for wages, and Catherine is buried next to her in Stockbridge. So they were companions for quite a long time. Catherine published 6 novels, 2 biographies, and 8 works for children, as well as novellas and over 100 pieces of short prose and other works. So she was published quite often. For many years, though, her work was overlooked, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in my face-to-face lecture coming up about why I think her work was overlooked. But recently, literary critics and historians recognized her as the primary founder of distinctly American literature. So Washington Irving, James Fenimore Cooper, who wrote Last of the Mohicans. We talked before about the book Wieland by Charles Brockden Brown and how that is also really an American work, but had some shades of the Gothic and sort of German aspects to that book. But really, her work was rediscovered in the 1970s by feminist scholars who were trying to find female authors who were quite successful and had been overlooked for many years. So I'm glad that they found this book, and I'm really happy to be sharing it with you. Some of the themes in her work. Sedgwick was a Unitarian. We are going to talk about that more in a moment. Her work shows consistent tolerance for members of minority groups. In addition, other religions may be criticized, but they're never condemned. So Hope Leslie shows a sympathetic understanding, not only of Native Americans, but also their religious beliefs. Her fiction often emphasized the political and personal need for liberty and independence. My mouse got away from me there. Particularly among women. So it's interesting to me, she wasn't really part of the civil rights movement for women's suffrage that kind of came to fruition a couple decades later. But she really thought that women could find political freedom without organizing what she called social agitation. And she was a proponent for Republican motherhood. This is a term that I would like you to try to remember. That's a theme that she wove through many of her stories, including the one that you'll be reading. We'll talk about more what that means in a little bit. But she decided to remain single and have independence to focus on her own writing. So she believed that women could have more of a social impact through being wives and being mothers and teaching their children and having an impact on society in that way. It seems that she did have some opportunities to marry and really chose not to. Decided that she could do more in the world if she were independent and single. So, Republican motherhood, as promised. The idea of Republican motherhood is an attitude toward women's roles centered on the belief that patriots' daughters should be raised to uphold the ideals of liberty and inalienable rights. So that particular belief of Americans, that we have the right to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, right? That's something that we don't just teach men, that we should teach women also. So Republican motherhood really means that all children should be raised to value patriotism and to sacrifice their own needs for the greater good of the country. And certainly in this book, we are going to see a sacrifice toward the end by one of the characters. And I don't want to give that away too much. But one of the characters makes a choice that there's an issue of a love triangle, and one of them decides, I'm the third wheel here, and these two really belong together. We also see the sacrifice of Megawiska. As I mentioned before, she tries to save Everil and jumps in front of her father's axe. So again, sacrificing her own need for the greater good. Sons were encouraged to pursue roles in government, and daughters were educated more than previously allowed in order to pass on these values to the next generation. In this way, the Republican mother was considered a custodian of civic virtue, responsible for upholding the morality of her husband and children. So the idea really, Republican, not the way we would think of it today, you know, you're a Republican or you're a Democrat, but the republic of the United States, that you are helping to uphold that, and that by doing so, you're fulfilling your duty. Some people think that Republican motherhood is feminism, is sort of proto or pre-feminism, and other people think that it's not. It's kind of hard to categorize, because on the one hand, it really reinforces the idea, and I have it here, the traditional domestic women's sphere is separate from the public world of men, meaning that really women are based in the home, and that is their sphere, that's their realm of influence, while men have influence out in public, right? Which is quite an anti-feminist idea. But on the other hand, it did encourage women to be educated. And it showed that even if women are working only in this domestic sphere, that they can have a dignity and an importance that was missing before from the conceptions of women's work. So that we don't say, for example, we don't say typically anymore that somebody's a housewife, right? That implies that they are just at home, scrubbing the floors or something. But when we say it's stay-at-home mom, that someone is a stay-at-home mother, that kind of indicates, right, that is that person's job, that they are staying at home and that they are helping to raise their children. Other things that we might say is a home economist or family manager, those kind of terms. And I think that this is interesting because I do think that a lot of stay-at-home moms do see themselves in this way. This is my sphere of influence, and I am helping to raise children to be educated, and to I'm raising them in a way that I spend more time with them, and that then they can be better people in the world. Before this time period, that really was not as much the case. So it's kind of interesting, and you can definitely see some of the beliefs in this coming out in this book, particularly with Martha. Martha has a very long letter that she writes to her husband, and I'd like you guys to examine that letter and think about how Martha is trying to be a good Republican mother. So, the Colonists and the Pequots. This is a picture. I'm going to zoom in on it here. Showing a fortified town. You can see the spikes here. And from about that same time, I think that might be Jamestown or Roanoke, not necessarily Massachusetts, but Hope Leslie is set in the 1610s to 1640s, but most of it takes place in the 1630s and 40s in Massachusetts Bay Colony, which included parts of present-day Massachusetts as well as Maine, New Hampshire, and Connecticut. The colony was founded in 1628, and there were over 20,000 colonists there, mostly English Puritans, including Calvinist Protestants, who resisted forms of worship imposed by the established Church of England. So what happened in England is that you had various kings or queens, and they would dictate what religion people held. For a long time, they were part of the Catholic Church, and then you have kings who thought that the Catholic Church had too much power and that they wanted more power, and so they became, with Henry VIII, the head of the Church of England. That became the established religion. And then after Henry VIII, there's this skirmish between monarchs who are Catholic and think that the country should go back to being Catholic, and monarchs who are Anglican, coming from the word English, right? So thinking that they should stay the Church of England. And other people who are Protestants are feeling the pressures of this and really want to escape. They shouldn't have their faith dictated by whoever happens to be sitting on the throne that year. So this is really a central point to the book, that we have people who are fighting for religious freedom, and yet they are themselves intolerant of other religions. We're going to talk more about that in a couple minutes. But what happened with this colony is that a few years after it was established, there were some problems with the Native Americans who had been living there before the settlers came, as there would be in our country now if people came in and just tried to sort of settle where we had already been living. So the conflict was fought over several years in what is now Massachusetts and Connecticut between the Pequot tribe and the English colonists. And what happened was really that the English colonists banded together with the Narragansett tribes and their Mohegan allies in order to defeat the Pequots. And eventually, the war was really over trade. Now, the other picture is something different. I'll get to that in a second. You're like, why is there a picture of Florida? We're talking about Massachusetts. Conflict had simmered between them for decades, and the Pequot killed some English traders. Massachusetts Bay Colony sent expeditions against the tribe to punish them, and then the conflict came to a head at Mystic, Connecticut, when a fortified village was wiped out and most of its inhabitants were killed. So the people in the story of Hope Leslie, this is not a direct history. This is historical fiction, and that's important to remember. She's playing kind of fast and loose with the historical details, but it is well researched, but there's still a lot of things that she's manipulating to tell a good story. But at any rate, the characters in this book are quite aware of what has already happened. They are trying to, some of them, prevent this from happening again. And we have Manonoto is the chief. He is grieving over the losses that he suffered during this war. He has now been basically dethroned, and he's trying to get back his family, who have been some sold into slavery and some, given as servants to the English colonists. So you can kind of imagine his point of view, and the author is really clear that this is something that we should understand his point of view, and we should sympathize with him. And if your children were taken away from you and given to your enemy as servants, you would probably also go after them. I mean, you can watch just about any Liam Neeson movie and see that happening, right? So the Pequots in this war were eventually defeated. The tribe was really almost completely eliminated. Many of its members were killed or captured. Some were sold into slavery down to the West Indies. You have a lot of people don't know, I think, that there were some Native Americans who were enslaved. There were also some Native Americans who owned slaves, so it's really quite a complicated history. But this is what is going on at the time the novel is set. Sedgwick's interest in this history may have reflected her awareness of the Indian removal controversies that were going on in the 1800s. She really tries to portray the tribes in a very sympathetic light, but in her time, Native American tribes, especially in the Southeast, this is a little bit before westward expansion, which kind of happened after the Civil War especially, but the Indian Removal Act of 1830 occurred just a couple years after Hope Leslie was published. And I'm going to zoom in on here now. So basically, the Seminole of Florida, the Choctaw of Mississippi, the Chickasaw from this area, the Creek, and the Cherokee were all removed to over here, what's known as Indian Territory. Later on, more so, and then of course we have reservations set up in various locations, right? Some of which still remain today. So it seems in part because of her beliefs and her political stance that she is very sympathetic toward the plight of the Native Americans and wants to show historically how some of these things came about. All right, so here is an excerpt. How any use, you surely do not doubt, Martha, that these Indians possess the same faculties that we do. The girl just arrived, our friend writes to me, hath rare gifts of mind, such as few of God creatures are endowed with. So this is Fletcher writing a letter to Martha while he is away about Megawiska. So Megawiska is the girl that he's referring to, and he's saying she has rare gifts of mind. Few of God's creatures are as intelligent and sensitive as she is. So few people are as smart or as kind. She is just 15. She understands and speaks English perfectly well, having been taught it by an English captive who for a long time dwelt with her tribe. On that account, she was much noticed by the English who traded with the Pequots, and young as she was, she acted as their interpreter. She is the daughter of one of their chiefs, and when this wolfish tribe were killed or dislodged from their dens, she, her brother, and their mother were brought with a few other captives to Boston. They were given for a spoil to the soldiers. Okay, so in the yellow, I have highlighted compliments that he's giving her. She has rare gifts of mind. She has the same faculties that we do. She understands and speaks English perfectly well, which would have been really of benefit. And then you can kind of see, the author is still the author is still of her time, and she's still a person in the 1800s. So we have this very racist depiction here. They're a wolfish tribe and they were killed and dislodged from their dens. Throughout this book, we have nature used with similes, with metaphors, sometimes in symbolism, she uses it to describe or symbolize this Native American tribe or some of the Native American characters. So here they're wolfish and they're dislodged from their dens. Not saying when this poor pitiable tribe was killed or when they were dislodged from their homes that were set afire by newcomers to this land, right? That's not, so my point here, I guess, is that she is progressive, but she's still part of the time when she's writing. She's ahead of her time. She's not quite to the point where we would be today. Some, by a Christian use of money, were redeemed. And others, I blush to say it, for it is God's gift that every man should enjoy the good of his own labor, were sent into slavery in the West Indies. So here, even though she's writing before the abolition of slaves, she's advocating that every man should enjoy the good of his own labor. And we're going to see that idea really come to fruition in Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. But here, the author, you can tell, feels the same way. Manoka, the mother of these children, was noted for singular dignity and modesty of her demeanor. Many notable instances of her kindness to the white traders are recorded. So these Puritan people would have really admired these qualities: dignity, modesty, kindness. And when she was taken to Boston, our worthy governor, ever mindful of his duties, assured her that her good deeds were held in remembrance, and that he would testify the gratitude of his people in any way she would direct. "I have nothing to ask," she said, "but that I and my children may receive no personal dishonor." So that's the only thing that she wants. She's not asking for riches. She's not asking even for freedom. She just does not want them to be dishonored. So you can see how, hopefully you can see how this really would be a revolutionary way of talking about Native Americans, especially in the 1800s, that they have rare gifts of mind, that they have dignity, that they have modesty, that they have kindness, and that they are capable of good deeds. I want to take a moment to kind of explain what the Puritans believe, as those are the characters in this story, many of whom are Puritan. And then we're going to talk next about how the author's beliefs differed greatly from the Puritan beliefs. So she's really trying to, a lot of the book has to do with religion. That's a major theme in this text. So it's kind of important to have an understanding of what the differences are so that we can better understand the author's messages of the book. This is a Puritan woman, or the depiction of one at any rate. So, sin. Puritans believe that Adam, the first man, fell from God when he sinned, and since then men have been born fully depraved. You'll have this repeated word in this book where some of the Puritans say, "I am such a worm," meaning that we have been born into sin and only God can bring us out of that sin, and we're no better than worms. We're crawling on the ground, horrible creatures. And it's really to show how little they thought of themselves. So look for that particular word. Grace. Jesus Christ was God and God's Son. This is going to differ from the author's beliefs. He offered himself freely and died for the sins of all people. A person must believe in Christ in order to be saved. Again, this is going to differ from the author's beliefs and the beliefs of many of the people in this book. Works. So unlike other Protestants, Puritans didn't believe. Some Christians believe in salvation by grace, that if you believe in Jesus, that then you are saved. Other people, including the Puritans, they said, no, you also have to have good works. So you can't just believe. That's not enough. Your evidence of your salvation has to show through your actions and your good works. Now, this is going to come up with both Hope and Everell, as there are some questions that some of the Puritans have about whether or not they're actually saved, because they seem to be doing good works, but also some of their actions are contrary to Puritan beliefs, and certainly they are a little bit too happy and flippant and joyful for some of the Puritans. Conversion, a rejection of the worldliness of society, and a strict adherence to biblical principles. God can forgive anything, but man could only change their behavior. So actions speak louder than words, and actions had to be constantly controlled because of this. So they're very concerned with what they're doing, making sure that what they're doing matches the expectations of them. So this is going to come out in our book in two ways. The first is, if I can spell it right, sorry for this horrible rendering. That word is hypocrisy. Hypocrisy. The author is trying to show, there we go. The author is trying to show that what this leads to is people being hypocritical, where they are showing the right deeds, but their hearts really are not in it, as opposed to Hope and Everil, who have good hearts, but maybe don't do the right thing outwardly all the time. The other thing I'd like you to look for is Aunt Grafton. Aunt Grafton is very worldly. Worldliness again. So some of her worldliness is going to get her and other people into trouble. She really only cares about hats and clothes and things like that. Other times it's used really as comic relief, to show how silly she is, and how the author is kind of saying, you know, she's not condemning Puritans completely the way Nathaniel Hawthorne does. What she's saying is some of their ideas are really not that bad. Worldliness and vanity are silly things that should not be found in people, that we should get rid of. Rejection. So people of opposing theological views were asked to leave the community or be converted. And that becomes quite important, especially with Nalima's capture, as she is being tried for witchcraft. Hope is hoping that she will not be punished by death, but that certainly would be a possible punishment that Nalima could receive, even though she herself is a Native American who happens to be living on the outskirts of this town. The other thing, too, is the conversion. Martha is quite intent on trying to convert Anoko and Magawiska when they come to live with her as servants, and they really have no interest in that whatsoever. Okay, and there's the Puritan man. 6, predestination. God has already chosen the elect. So basically the idea of predestination was Calvinist, and it said that God didn't just know who would be in heaven or hell, but that he had really chosen who was going to heaven and who was going to hell. This kind of also led to this strange belief that those who are wealthy are blessed by God, and those who are, and they are in good standing with him. If you are poor, you may not be blessed by God, so you possibly have done something wrong, which is really antithetical to what it says in the scriptures, but nevertheless something that they kind of believed, at least culturally. They had that belief. The reason that this is important is because the author did not believe in this and is trying to kind of go out of her way to show the faulty idea that God has chosen who's going to be in heaven and hell, and that only by being good Puritans can people get there. Work ethic, hard work was an honor to God and led to a prosperous reward. Again, kind of connecting to this idea of people who are wealthy. The church elders are political leaders, so any church infraction is also a social infraction and a legal infraction. So if you really watch for Winthrop, the governor, if people go against the church, they're going against also the government, right? Because it's a theocracy. Evil. The devil is behind every deed. Constant watch. Constant vigilance to stay away from his clutches. So what I want you to watch for here is a servant named Jeanette. Jeanette is kind of a very, very strict Puritan, is worried about the devil, is worried about Aunt Grafton has a Book of Common Prayer from the Church of England. Jeanette becomes quite upset about that. She thinks that the Native Americans are really devilish, and so sometimes this is shown to be really detrimental, and other times, again, it's used as a little bit of comic relief because she's so silly. And then the Trinity, God is three persons united in one. This is a hard concept to kind of grasp, but I like this analogy that we have the peel of the apple, we have the flesh of the apple, and we have the core of the apple. The core is a core, but it's also part of the apple, right? The flesh is the flesh, but it's also part of the apple. So the Puritans and many Christians today, most Christians, believe that God is three persons: God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. We talked about already the role that they believed that Jesus took. God the Father is the creator, and then the Holy Spirit is basically God working in people so that they can live a more righteous life. So for Puritans, this would have been that work ethic, or it would have been piety. And what they talk about with people, especially Esther, that Esther has these graces, and it seems that Esther has really tries to walk with the Holy Spirit and to live a pure life. So those are some things to look for. And again, the character sheet that I'm going to give you can help you with some of these things. But these are the Puritan beliefs, and they're influencing really all of the characters in the story. Also, though, influencing this story are the author's beliefs. Now, I have to be honest here, the Unitarian Church kind of develops first, and then they combined with the Universalist Church, and now we know them as Unitarian Universalists. I am not able to determine where the author kind of fell in this process of unification, but I think from reading this book and from some of her other works that it's pretty clear that she holds to a lot of their beliefs. So the Trinity that we just talked about, 3 in 1, the Unitarian, uni meaning one and tri means three, right? So Unitarians like unicycle, one. Trinitarians tri like a tricycle, 3. Unitarians say there's not a Trinity. God is just one, and it's one person, father or mother, or kind of genderless God, possibly, and that Christ was inspired by God. So Jesus was inspired by God, but was not God himself. And some initially would say that, yes, Jesus did come to save people, and others later on would say, not really. He's more of a prophet who understood God. They reject a little bit different than the rejection of the Puritans. They don't believe in original sin. They don't believe in predestination, and they don't believe in the infallibility of the Bible. So these are all things that the Puritans and many Christian faiths believe today. So why does this matter? It seems like a kind of, for many people, a small point of theology. It matters because these characters are working within different understandings of the world. So if they understand that they're born into original sin, that they're no better than a worm, and that they have to believe in God and do the right thing every moment, to prove that they have salvation, they're going to act quite a bit differently than if they reject the idea that and say, hey, God has not decided who's going to heaven and who's going to hell, as is told to us in the idea of predestination. And therefore, people can make up their own minds and they have a little bit more free will, right? If they say no, there's no original sin, well, then what are we born into? Do we have the possibility to live sinless lives or to put out as much good into the world as we're able to? Possibly. If the Bible is not, infallibility means that the Bible can be wrong. And certainly for the Puritans, that would have been a revolutionary idea, right? Because that is what they're living their lives by. They further say that there is an emphasis of reason in interpreting any scripture, not just the Bible, but of other faiths as well. That's kind of the picture here. And there's freedom of conscience and freedom of the pulpit. Universal. So if God is only one person, then people of diverse cultures and faiths can try to come to an understanding of God through various spiritual practices. Now, this is a key to this book. And I'm going to read you guys an excerpt in just a moment where we can see that idea really coming through. I think... well, we'll get to it in a minute. Acceptance of every person, regardless of their culture or creed, and a belief in the inherent dignity of every person. Now, I want to be clear that these are some things that some other religions teach as well. It's just that we're redefining the word tolerance in various ways. Some people would say that tolerance is, I accept what you believe, but I don't necessarily believe it. And other people would say that tolerance is, if you believe that, then there must be some truth in it. And that is kind of where this particular faith leads. So the Unitarian Universalist symbol here showing pictures known from all different faiths. You have Christian and Jewish and Muslim and some pagan religions and also Buddhism, right? All under one umbrella. So this is from their website. The picture here is just, there we go, a depiction of, I believe it's the white settlers trying to convert the Native Americans. I think that's why I have that there. But this is from the Unitarian website, Universalist Unitarian. Direct experience of that transcending mystery and wonder affirmed in all cultures, which moves us to a renewal of the spirit and an openness to the forces which create and uphold life. Wisdom from the world's religions, which inspires us in our ethical and spiritual life. And so you'll notice, too, not even necessarily that we believe everything, but that this inspires us and that it's wisdom from any religion. Christian and Jewish teachings call us to respond to God's love. Humanist teachings counsel us to heed the guidance of reason and the results of science. Spiritual teachings from earth-centered traditions celebrate the sacred circle of life and instruct us to live in harmony and the rhythms of nature. These principles are sources of faith, are the backbone of our religious community. So these are the contemporary beliefs, but certainly most of these were there at the time the author was writing. And let's look at her excerpt. So Hope has just found out that Faith is married to Onoko, and she is quite distressed by this. God forbid, exclaimed Hope, shuddering as if a knife had been plunged in her bosom. My sister marrying to an Indian. An Indian, exclaimed Magawiska, recoiling with a look of proud contempt that showed she reciprocated with full measure the scorn expressed for her race. Yes, an Indian in whose veins runs the blood of the strongest, the fleetest of the children of the forest, who never turned their backs on friends or enemies, and whose souls have returned to the Great Spirit stainless as they came from him. Think ye your blood will be corrupted by mingling with this stream? Long before Megawiska ceased to pour out her indignation, Hope's first emotion had given place to a burst of tears. She wept aloud in her broken utterance of, "Oh, my sister, my dear mother," emitted but imperfect glimpses of the ruined hopes, the bitter feelings that oppressed her. There was a chord in Megawiska's heart that needed but the touch of tenderness to respond in harmony. Her pride vanished, and her indignation gave place to sympathy. She said in a low, soothing voice, "Now, do not weep thus. Your sister is well with us. She is cherished as the bird cherishes her young." "There lies my mother," cried Hope, without seeming to have heard Megawiska's consolations. "She lost her life in bringing her children to this wild world to secure them in the fold of Christ. Oh God, restore my sister to the Christian family." "And here," said Megawiska, in a voice of deep pathos, "here is my mother's grave. Think ye not that the Great Spirit looks down on these sacred spots, where the good and the peaceful rest with equal eye? Think ye not that their children are his children, whether they are gathered in yonder temple where your people worship, or bow to him beneath the green boughs of the forest?" There was certainly something thrilling in Megawiska's faith, and she now succeeded in riveting Hope's attention. So, a lot here. But the first thing is, go back. The first thing is the idea of interracial relationships. And here we go. An Indian in whose blood runs the blood of the strongest, the fleetest of the children of the forest, never turn their backs on friends or enemies. And the souls have returned to the Great Spirit, stainless as they came from him. So, going against the Puritan idea that people are born into original sin, here Megawiska is saying, no, when children are born, they are stainless, and when they return, they are also stainless. Talking about the Great Spirit with the same reverence as the Puritans talk about God, and also having Hope really convey what would have been, even obviously for readers of 1827, horrifying to think of interracial marriage. Many places in our country, interracial marriage, miscegenation laws, which are laws against interracial relationships, those went right into the 1960s. So here, this is over 100 years before that. And Hope is just expressing the ideas of her time, let alone the time that the author's writing. But then the author is really almost rebutting those arguments, right? Megawiska is saying, no, we have noble blood. We are, do you think that your blood would be corrupted by mingling with us, who are so noble and so beloved? And then Hope changes and starts saying, oh no, this is because of my dear mother, because my mother died to bring us to this country where true Christians were living. And it's interesting to me that the first objection is on racial grounds, and that quickly changes, and then the real conversation is about religion and religious differences. So Megawiska's heart is touched with tenderness, trying to have sympathy and understand this girl's point of view. So again, painting her very sympathetically and showing that she's almost better than the girl she's talking to. She talks to her in soothing tones. Your sister is well with us. There's a lot there about how her sister's being taken care of that I took out. And then Hope again says, here's my mother. She wants to, dear God, please restore my sister to her Christian family. And then Magawiska says this, and I think this is really one of the key passages in this book. Here is my mother's grave. So Hope has just said, there lies my mother, and Magawiska says, well, here is my mother's grave. And they're buried in the same cemetery. Do you not think that the Great Spirit, right, we're making a tie there, the author is rather, looks down on these, both of these are sacred spots. He's looking at both of these with an equal eye. The children are his in either way. Doesn't matter if they're worshiping in the temple or the forest. And our author basically is trying to say, no, it does not matter. And she has many incidents like this throughout the book. We have another incident with a man named Gorton, who was a historical figure at the time, a Puritan who was teaching things that were really considered heresies, so going against the Puritan faith. And what's the result of this? There's something thrilling in her faith that rivets Hope's attention. So Hope is not only exposed to the Puritan beliefs, but also to the Anglican beliefs of her upbringing and of her Aunt Grafton. And now she is also exposed to these Native American beliefs. And because of that, comes to a place closer to the author's own viewpoint. Later on, she learns that her sister is Catholic, and she tries to prevent her sister from being persecuted because of that Catholic faith. So it's quite interesting and intricate. I hope that you have a better understanding of the dynamics going on here, because I think that religion, to say that it's just a theme is putting it mildly. All right, so next time I'm going to talk about more things to know about Hope Leslie. It looks like it's a PowerPoint, but it's not. It's actually going to be a face-to-face lecture. We're going to talk a little bit more about the rights of women, the structure of the book, and also how this book came into scholars' attention. So a little bit of that coming up next. Other than that, have a great day. Thanks.